I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, where history, horror, and humanity collide. Every episode, we go beyond the headlines, the soldiers, the murderers, the martyrs, and the ghosts that history tried to forget. Some of these stories are old, some are still unfolding, but they all ask the same question. What drives ordinary people to cross the line between duty and destruction? This is Deadly Truths. By the end of 1934, America's so-called public enemy era was collapsing under its own legend. Dillinger was dead, Pretty Boy Floyd was dead, Bonnie and Clyde were dead. But the story did not end there, not for the ones history forgot. Beyond every headline name were men and women who bled in the shadows, the drivers, the partners, the outliers. They built the myth, but they never got the glory. What came next was not justice. It was being erased. The quiet removal of the names that did not fit into any legends. There was Harry Pierpont. He was the mentor. He was born in October 13th of 1902 in Muncie, Indiana. After moving to Indianapolis with his family, he worked as a bench worker in an auto plant in the 1920s. A serious head injury in the summer of 1921 might have triggered changes in his behavior. He started having headaches and sleeplessness. There was unexplained aggression. Around 1921, there is information that can be found about him being committed to the state hospital for the mentally ill. So you got to think, that's a bit interesting, right? Around 1922, he was sentenced for assault and battery with intent to murder. And in 1924 to 25, he was involved with a bank robber gang in Indiana. It was called and this is a long one, Pierpont Bridgewater Northern Gang. It was responsible for multiple bank heists and car thefts. He was paroled in March of 1924, but by 1925, he was back in trouble. He was arrested in Detroit under the alias Frank Mason with about $850 in cash. He had guns and an apartment. He was transferred to Indiana State Prison, where he became, according to many sources, the mentor to both Dillinger and Homer Van Meter. On September 25th, 1933, Pierpont engineered a breakout from Michigan City Prison alongside Russell Clark, Charles Makeley, and John Red Hamilton. On October 12th of 1933, the gang broke John Dillinger out of Allen County Jail in Ohio. Pierpont was a central planner for prison breakouts. On October 23rd of 1933, there was a robbery of the Central National Bank in Ohio. It was conducted under his supervision, and $74,000 was stolen in cash and bonds. There were no shots fired. For back then, $74,000 is a whole lot of money, and you gotta admit, even though this guy had a head injury and had been committed to the state hospital for mental illness, he had definitely become very crafty after that head injury. Their success did draw attention. Why wouldn't it, right? So by 1933 and early 1934, they made some mistakes and ended up in Tucson, Arizona, where they were exposed. Pierpont was arrested there for his part in robberies. At trial in March of 1934 for the murder of Sheriff Jess Sarber during the Allen County Jail escape, he was sentenced to death. Now, he did not shoot that sheriff. However, someone else within that gang did. And back then, they looked at it as, hey, you planned the breakout. Somebody died in the middle of the breakout. You might as well have pulled the trigger yourself. On October 17th of 1934, he was executed via the electric chair at the Ohio Penitentiary. He had been wounded in a failed escape attempt earlier that September, though. So even once he was put in jail and condemned to death, he still tried to break out before his execution. So why does all this matter? It explains the pre-Dillinger era, and it adds depth to these stories. Most of us only hear about Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Babyface, but we don't hear about everything that went on behind the scenes and the people who helped the ones who became legends. But history always has a way of forgetting. And a lot of these people, most of us have never even heard of. He wasn't just another member of the gang. He was the planner. He was the mentor. And he was not in the limelight. His mental and physical injury background, it gives extra dimension there. There's this idea of the past shaping the person into the outlaw that he became. And the breakouts and the bank jobs, that emphasizes that he was basically the brains behind that operation. He was precise, he was methodical, he did not care about showmanship. His death does mark a turning point very cleanly, where the myth begins to crumble and the machine of law enforcement refocuses, because we're emphasizing forgotten names here. Pierpont is a strong example of someone behind the scene who actually defined how this era did unfold. He is described as calm, organized, and dangerous. He was not a thrill seeker. He was an operator, the mind that turned small-time stick-ups into organized heists. Pierpont, he planned the Dillinger jailbreak. And he set loose the man who would define a decade of outlaw mythology. Even Dillinger called him the brains. But intelligence did not save him in the end. And after the 1934 Tucson raid, he was wounded, handcuffed, still dressed like a banker. He did not beg. He did not cut a deal. And on October 17th, 1934, Michigan City Prison threw the switch. Pierpont's death proved that Dillinger's gang was not immortal, and that Hoover's new America would rather burn its myths than risk letting them fade naturally. Now we're going to move on to Eddie Green. He was called the middleman. Harold Eugene Green was born on November 2nd of 1898. Pueblo, Colorado. He drifted into crime in the 1920s, serving time for robbery and auto theft under a string of aliases. By the early 1930s, Green had become very sought after in the Midwest. The man who scoped banks, mapped getaway routes, supplied safe houses, and quietly linked the Dillinger gang up with the Barker Carpus crew. So obviously, Eddie Green played a big part there. He operated heavily in the Twin Cities region, leveraging a network of contacts within St. Paul's underworld and apparently among corrupt officials. So up there in Minnesota and North and South Dakota. When the law closed in, Green was ambushed in his St. Paul hideout in early April 1934. He was shot in the head and shoulder by federal agents. He lingered in a guarded hospital bed for almost a week, delirious, before finally dying around April 10th. While conscious, he reportedly named names and dropped clues, a final act that helped dismantle the gang machine. Green never became a public enemy headline. He didn't stage bank robberies for fame. He did his work quietly. And in the end, his death was a less dramatic shootout than a press release with a pulse. He is the forgotten man who connected the dots, and he was gone, and the myth marched on without him. It is important to note that Eddie Green had been a cop once, a St. Paul patrolman who figured out there was more money robbing banks than there was guarding him. And when he became the bridge between Dillinger's outfit and the Barker gang, he then also opened the door to becoming the getaway driver and the fixer and even the occasional safecracker. When the FBI did corner him in St. Paul, they shot him before he could even speak. Hoover did call it a victory, but Green never killed anybody. Then we have Arthur Doc Barker. He was the last of Ma's boys. He was born on June 4th, 1899 in Aurora, Missouri. He was the third son of George and Kate. By the early 1930s, he had joined the Barker Karpus gang, participating in high-profile kidnappings and bank robberies. After the death of his brother Fred and his ma in Florida, that shootout on January 16th, 1935, the Barker era of myth, it was collapsing. He was arrested in Chicago days later and convicted of conspiracy in the Bremer kidnapping scheme. They shipped him to Alcatraz. On the pre-dawn hours of January 13th, 1939, Barker and 3 fellow inmates cut their way out of D Block in Alcatraz, reached the island's western shoreline in dense fog, and found guards waiting. Barker was struck and died the same day. The newspaper called it justice. In truth, it was just another name being erased. When they found him after his mother and brother were killed, they found him in Chicago and he had $8,000 left on him from a kidnapping ransom. It was stuffed in his coat. When they sent him to Alcatraz, he only lasted there for 4 years before he was shot in the failed attempt to escape. Again, there was no talking. The guards just opened fire. His body laid there on the rocks, and he was still holding the cutters. Next, we have Homer Van Meter. He is called the Wild Card. He was born on December 3rd, 1905 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He ran away early, drifted into crime, and by the 1930s found his way into the orbit of John Dillinger. Van Meter was flashy, talkative. He liked wearing fedoras. He enjoyed the spotlight, which made him both useful, but it also exposed him. After Pierpont's fall, Van Meter became Dillinger's right-hand man. But right hands get cut off. On August 23, 1934, at Marion Street and University Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota, he walked into an ambush of heavily armed officers. The official story was he ignored orders, fled into an alley, fired a shot, then went down under a hail of bullets. He was only 28 years old. The body was more than a capture. It was a message. When talking about Van Meter's story, it reinforces the idea of someone behind the myth who didn't get that spotlight that you saw with Dillinger. He was not the most famous, but he was deeply involved. He had a flashy style, and that exposure illustrates how the cleanup phase didn't just target the big names, it targeted the associates and the mid-tier players. The brutal way he died, many bullet wounds, an ambush, it emphasizes the extermination tone of this era. How all of these people were just being shot repeatedly in a hail of bullets. It was not just law enforcement arresting outlaws, but systematic destruction of what remained. Police, of course, claimed he was armed. The witnesses said he was not. His body, like Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde and Pretty Boy Floyd and Babyface, was displayed to crowds like a trophy. But unlike the others, there's not a lot of pictures left around for anybody to look at. The message was clear again. The Bureau did not arrest outlaws anymore. It was exterminating them. Another one that I find really fascinating is Russell Red Hamilton, and he's called the Ghost. He was shot through the back at Little Bohemia in 1934. He was left to die. His friends hid him in a Chicago safe house. No one knows exactly when he died or what happened. Some say he died later from infection, weeks after the fact. Others claim he escaped and lived under a false name. The FBI files list him as deceased unconfirmed. So there's a big question mark there. There was no body, there's no funeral, no closure, just red ink note in silence. Russell Red Hamilton, he was born in August of 27th in 1898, and he was from Ontario, Canada. He drifted into the same outlaw network as Harry Pierpont and John Dillinger. He was not a headline name, but he was a trusted man on the inside. When it came to Little Bohemia Lodge in Wisconsin, Hamilton was wounded in the back, as I had mentioned, and Dillinger's game exploded out of the raid and escaped. He managed to escape to Hastings, Minnesota, but the bullet turned septic. So that's where a lot of people believe that he did die days later from infection and that he was buried secretly somewhere in Illinois. Others claim he vanished under a false name and lived on and died old. Nobody, though, can verify either of those claims. He is just a forgotten name. When I had discussed Pretty Boy Floyd and his last days, he was running with a man named Adam Richetti. Richetti is the fall guy. He was born on August 5th, 1909 in Texas. He drifted into crime after a robbery conviction in Indiana at only the age of 19. By the early 1930s, he had teamed up with Pretty Boy Floyd, and he was riding with him through a series of bank robberies. On June 17th, 1933, there was that infamous Kansas City Massacre, and they had connected Pretty Boy Floyd and Richetti and officially identified them as the gunmen. This, of course, is not true. However, back then, it was considered to be true. So they were on the run. And poor young Adam Richetti definitely had a bullseye on his back. He was captured later, and he was convicted of murder in Missouri, even though he was not in Missouri and he did not take part in the Kansas City Massacre, but they did convict him of it. They executed him via the state's gas chamber on October 7th in 1938. He did not give any dramatic last words. Witnesses said he was very calm, he was polite, and he was silent. He understood that he had outlived his usefulness, I suppose, on a very tragic level. When he was executed, he was only 28 years old. What's really sad about Richetti is that there's just no solid proof whatsoever that he ever fired a shot, but it did not matter. He was convicted of killing Officer Irv Kelly during that ambush in Kansas City, and he was executed. Everybody knows about Bonnie and Clyde, but very few people know about Buck Burrow and Blanche Burrow. Marvin Buck Burrow was born on March 14, 1903 in Marion County, Texas. He was the older brother to Clyde Burrow. He spent some time in jail, and after his release in March of 1933, he joined Clyde, Bonnie Parker, and others in Joplin, Missouri for some armed robberies. On July 19th, 1933, at the Red Crown Tourist Court near Platte City, Missouri. Who's been to Platte City? Hey, I've even lived there, which is right outside of Kansas City, Missouri, just north of Kansas City. Buck was mortally wounded in the head during a shootout. His wife, Blanche, was wounded as well. He died of his injuries on the 29th of July, so just 10 days later. It was pretty clear, though, from the initial shootout that he was not likely to survive, as the gunshot wound to his head did expose brain tissue, according to the doctor's reports. Blanche, his wife, was born Benny Iva Codwell on January 1st of 1911 in Garvin, Oklahoma. She married Buck on July 3rd of 1931. She accompanied him and eventually joined the Burrow gang's hideouts and their robberies, though she claims she never fired a gun. During the July 1933 shootout at Platte City, she was blinded in one eye by glass fragments from the shattered windows. She was arrested with Buck. She was tried and convicted in Missouri for assault with intent to kill related to the Platte City incident. She did serve 6 years of a 10-year sentence, and she was paroled in 1939. After release, she moved to Dallas. She married a man named Eddie Frazier and lived out her life. She did write a memoir. It was called My Life with Bonnie and Clyde, and it described the brutal reality. She discussed flies on bullet wounds, hunger, and infection. It definitely did not depict any glamour that the movies later portrayed. Last but certainly not least, we have John Paul Chase, and he's the last man standing. He was born in San Francisco in 1901. He was not a killer. He was a driver, a bootlegger, and a man who made very bad friends at the wrong time. One of those friends was Lester Gillis, Babyface, who was absolutely crazy. Chase was the wheel man through Nelson's robberies and escapes, often the only reason Nelson got away alive. In November of 1934, outside Barrington, Illinois, the law finally caught up. Nelson and Chase traded fire with agents Sam Cowley and Ed Hollis. Both agents were killed. Nelson took 17 bullets before bleeding out that night. Chase was wounded, but he was still alive, the only survivor of the Public Enemy era next to Creepy Carpus. He was caught weeks later in California and sent to Alcatraz for life, keeping company with Carpus. He never caused any trouble. He never talked to reporters, and he spent 30 years behind bars. He was paroled around the same time as Alvin Karpis in 1966. He lived quietly in California until his death in 1973. He never did any interviews. He did not write any memoirs. He just was a caretaker of the past. When asked once why he never spoke about Babyface Nelson, he only said, "Some stories already took enough out of me the first time." By 1939, every major public enemy was either dead or locked away. Pierpont and Richetti executed. Doc Barker shot on the rocks of Alcatraz. Van Meter, Green, Hamilton, dead in a field. Blanche Barrow, blind and forgotten. John Paul Chase, the last one left, along with Creepy Carpus, quietly serving time. Hoover called in a victory. America called it law and order. But if you walk the timeline backwards through the bullet holes, the mugshots, and all those myths, what you see doesn't really look much like justice. It just looks like exhaustion. It was a nation tired of its own rebellion. Hoover once said, "Crime has been crushed under the heel of the Bureau of Investigation." And maybe so, but so were the people who made him famous. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If you found this story compelling, follow it, rate it, share it on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, wherever you're listening. It helps keep these forgotten stories alive. And please do rate. It helps a lot. Research and narration, it's always done by me, as you can tell. Sources for this episode did include Reuters, the New York Times, the FBI archives, and contemporary court and press records from 1933 through 1939. And remember, the past is never dead. It's just doing time in the FBI archives. And this concludes the bonus season, Morally Bankrupt. I hope you guys enjoyed.